nor did anyone encourage me to do so. But if you'd asked me if I believe God exists, I would have said, sure, duh, of course God exists, it's obvious. However, when I joined AUB 2 years ago, I met many people who didn't think it was so obvious. They wanted to have ontological debates with me about God's existence. Ontological? What in the world is that? I found myself asking the question, what reason is there to believe that a supernatural being created our world, or made our world? The point of tonight's debate is to put all the cards on the table, hear all the arguments for and against atheism, and empower the audience to make a decision that is based on knowledge. It's at this point that I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight. To your left, Mr. Adam Deen, and to your right, Dr. Chris Johns. Adam Deen is an international public speaker on Muslim apologetics. He's an intellectual activist who has been working in the field of Muslim apologetics for almost a decade now. He has contributed to debates on issues ranging from ethics to religious philosophy and theology. He also debated leading atheists like Dan Barker, the author of Godless. Dr. Johns received his PhD in philosophy from Stony Brook University in 2007, specializing in the modern period. His article, The Grounds of Right and Obligation, Enlightenments in Hobbes, appears in the Review of Metaphysics, March 2009. His current research focuses on Leibniz's relation to modern moral theorists such as Luke, Pufendorf, and Kant. Before coming to AUB, he was visiting assistant professor at St. Xavier University in Chicago. And the debate format for tonight will be as follows. There will be a 20-minute opening speech given by Adam Deen, followed by a 20-minute opening speech by Dr. Johns. This will then be followed by a 10-minute rebuttal by Adam Deen and a 10-minute rebuttal by Dr. Johns. Each speaker afterward will get 5 minutes to make a closing statement. After that, we'll have a question and answer session. So at this point, I'd like to call Adam Deen to the podium. Thank you very much.
In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. I'd like to begin by thanking Untitled for inviting me again. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you all for turning up. And also thank you to Professor Johns for accepting the invitation to debate me this evening. So, I'll be arguing that atheism is irrational. Now, according to the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, an atheist is someone who maintains that God does not exist, i.e. that there's evidence against his existence. Now, with respect to what a rational belief is, that is the definition we will be using, which is agreed upon myself and Professor Johns, is a belief that is proportionate to the evidence. So, my task this evening is to show that atheism is disproportionate to the evidence. Now, what I will also say is that it's come to light that Professor Johns is not actually an atheist. He is an agnostic. I'm not sure what happened a few days going back, but nevertheless, my arguments will show that not only is atheism irrational, but also that agnosticism, the idea that there isn't enough evidence either way, is also false. So, I have 5 arguments that I'd like to mention this evening, put forward this evening, and the first is atheism's inability to demonstrate the impossibility of the existence of God. So, when we think about God, when we mention God, God is that which, being no greater, can be conceived. The highest being possible that can be conceived. And that being would be a necessary being, a being that must exist. Now, when we postulate the very possibility that a necessary being can exist, it means that this being can exist in a possible world. What do I mean by a possible world? It is how the world, as in reality, could have been otherwise. Now, if it is possible for a necessary being to exist in a possible world, then it is possible that it exists in all possible worlds. Why is that? Because logical impossibilities and possibilities do not differ from one world to another. I.e., a squared circle is not only impossible in this world, but also in all possible worlds. So if it is possible for a necessary being to exist, and a necessary being exists in all possible worlds, that means that he exists in the actual world. Therefore, God exists. So I can summarize the argument as follows. It is possible that a necessary being can exist. 2, if it is possible for a necessary being to exist, then it is possible that he exists in some possible world. 3, if a necessary being exists in some possible world, then he exists in every possible world. If a necessary being exists in every possible world, then he must exist in the actual world. Therefore, God exists. I'm sure Professor John's got a lot to say about that argument. Now, my second argument is that the evidence of the origin of the universe points to theism, not atheism. Now, typically, atheists will deny the necessity of such a being, i.e. God, by postulating that the universe is eternal. If the universe is eternal, then it means that the universe does not need a cause. And if the universe does not need a cause, to postulate God as the cause of that universe would be superfluous. However, there is overwhelming evidence to suggest that the universe is not infinite in the past, but began to exist. First, philosophically, the idea of a beginningless universe presents to us insuperable difficulties. Why? Now, firstly, there's much debate about do actual infinites exist, especially in the mathematical world. But what we can say for sure, that we cannot arrive at an actual infinite by successive addition. Add 1, and so forth. Why? Just think of the largest number. You can't, because you can always add 1 more. Now, when we argue that the universe did not begin to exist and it is infinite in the past, we are saying that it has no beginning, and it also has an infinite series of past events. But this creates problems. Why? For if we chose an arbitrary moment in time, for example the present, that would mean there is an infinite series of past events for the present to actualize. But how does one traverse the infinite? The present would never actualize. We can illustrate this by saying this. Imagine I needed $1 to take the bus home. And I asked Rami, our host, this evening, for $1. And he said, of course, Adam, I will lend you $1, but I also have to borrow the money from somewhere else. And he asked Professor Johnson, he said, no, wait, no. He said he agrees. He offers to give him the $1. But this happens ad infinitum. Ad infinitum. Would I ever get home? No. In the similar case, the present would never actualize if we have to traverse the infinite. But let's add to the absurdity. This is it. Let's move one moment prior to the present, where we said it would never actualize. Would that actualize? No. Because there's also an infinite series of past events. And what about the moment before that? There is also an infinite series of past events. And what about the moment before that? And so forth. We would never have the present and the moments prior to it actualizing, because one would have to traverse the infinite. We can summarize this argument as follows, that a collection formed by successive addition cannot be an actual infinite. The series of past events are formed by successive addition, therefore the series of past events cannot be an actual infinite. Now, this conclusion that the universe has a beginning is also confirmed by science. For example, in 1929, Edwin Hubble discovered that there was a red shift, that the galaxies furthest away appeared redder than the ones that were closest to us. The reason for this is that the light is actually stretching as the universe expands. As the universe expands, the light is expanded and produces this redder appearance. Second point is the discovery by Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson in 1967. They discovered the CMB, the cosmic microwave background. Now, when matter is contracted, it naturally releases some form of heat. Now, if the universe began to exist and it is expanding, at one moment in time, the universe must have been giving off some kind of thermal energy, thermal heat. Now, radioactive heat. Now, what they actually stumbled, this Robert Wilson, Arno Penzias, was that what can be described as the kind of radioactive aftermath of this very dense moment in time. So what we have is confirmation on two accounts, the very red shift and also the CMB radio microwave background radiation. A third point that I'd like to mention this evening that the universe began to exist is the second law of thermodynamics. Now, according to this principle, any process within a closed system will end and lend towards equilibrium. Now, if the universe is a closed system, and according to atheism it is, all the energy, all the light and all the heat will come to an end. And what the scientists describe, the universe will come to a heat death. Now, if the universe has always existed, and given enough time, that the universe will end up in a heat death, why are we not experiencing that heat death now? Given the fact that we have existed for eternity, we should be experiencing that heat death now. But we're obviously not. I know it's hot today, but it's not that hot. So the very fact that we're not experiencing the heat death, the very fact that the universe is expanding, shows scientifically that we have a cosmic origin. But now, how do we suppress the inevitable question? How does something come from nothing? Professor Anthony Kennedy from Oxford University, he writes, a proponent of the Big Bang theory, at least, if he is an atheist, must believe the universe came from nothing by nothing. Now, who's going to accept that? Imagine now, we heard a bang behind me, and one of the members in the audience asked, what caused that bang? And I just said, hey, nothing, it just happened by itself. Now, that would be unintelligible. Who would accept that? And I'm sure Professor Johns wouldn't accept that answer either. So, let me summarize. What is true of the little bang is true of the Big Bang. So we can summarize the argument as follows. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe was caused. Third argument, that the evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe points to theism, not atheism. When we take the initial conditions of the universe and we convert them into mathematical equations, what we find are these constants and arbitrary quantities that have to be delicately and exquisitely fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life. Now, we can have three explanations of this delicate and exquisite fine-tuning: either natural necessity, chance, or design. Now, will natural necessity work here, that they have to be this way? Unfortunately not. This flies in the face of unknown physics. P.C.W. Davies, a British physicist, he says there is nothing in present ideas about laws of initial conditions remotely to suggest that their consistency with the laws of physics would imply uniqueness. Far from it. It seems then the physical universe does not have to be the way it is. It could have been otherwise. So that won't work. How about the idea that all of these constants and arbitrary quantities that have to be delicately fine-tuned, falling into these life-emitting ranges by accident? Will that work? No, because the odds are so against this happening. It just can't be maintained on a reasonable ground. For example, Stephen Hawking has estimated that if the rate of the expansion of the universe 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by 1 part out of 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed into a hot fireball. P.C.W. Davies has estimated that if the strength of gravity and the weak force were smaller by 1 part out of 10 to the 100th power, it would be impossible to sustain intelligent life. That's 1 followed by 100 zeros. So it seems that this is quite a hard position to maintain. Now, what we have to understand is it is not the case that if we alter these conditions, these constants and arbitrary quantities, that life would look very different. For example, we would have a different respiratory system, or we would have 4 legs instead of 2 legs. No. Or that men would be able to multitask. That's not what the outcome would be if we change these constants and arbitrary quantities. No. It would be impossible for life. Even if we change them in an infinitesimal amount, life would be impossible. Chemistry wouldn't exist. Atoms would not even form. So it's not an alternative that we can choose reasonably this evening, or any evening for that matter. So the only alternative to that is actually design. So I can summarize the arguments as that the fine-tuning of the universe is either is natural law, chance, or design. It is neither the natural law, chance, then therefore it is design. My fourth argument is the evidence of objective morality points to theism, not atheism. Now, when I speak about objective morality, what I mean is that it is valid and binding, whether we believe it or not, that good and evil actually exists in the world. For example, torturing a child for fun is objectively morally evil. Even if everyone in the world believed that it was fun, it would still be objectively morally evil. Now, typically what follows from atheism is naturalism, which holds that all that can exist in the world can be discovered by using our best scientific methods. But the problem here is that what we're looking for does not have a material property. It's an immaterial property. Morality, good and evil, for example, has no size, weight, touch, smell, density, any of those things. You cannot find morality in a test tube. You cannot conduct an experiment and then, lo and behold, good and evil pop out. That doesn't happen in the science lab. The late J.O. Mackie, a prominent philosopher of the previous century, confessed, moral properties constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely not to have arisen in the ordinary course of events, without an all-powerful God to create them. What's Mackie saying here? He's saying, look, if we say that good and evil exist in the world, it would be very hard to explain that reality if all that we have is a world made from physics and chemistry. Now suppose we went back to the history of the cosmos. The universe appeared. I don't hold that position, but anyway, it just appeared, and then we had these particles, and these particles formed and made planets and galaxies and so forth, and one of the planets had the necessary and sufficient conditions for the existence of intelligent life. Now, if I were to ask the question, why is it that human beings are carbon-based? That's an easy question to answer, given the naturalistic backdrop of creation. Very easy to answer. However, if I ask the question, why did good and evil come to exist? Now that's a very difficult question. It seems that we have no grounds to argue that point. I only seem to have 5 minutes, so I'm going to move along very, very quickly. I will add one more point here. So it seems that we can't seem to explain the existence of objective morality. Moreover, I would argue that if God doesn't exist and all that we are just animals, advanced primates, glorified chimps, if you like. The question here is, what grounds morality with animals? Because if we look at the animal kingdom, there is nothing forbidden in the animal kingdom. We don't accuse the hawk that steals from another hawk of stealing. We don't accuse the lion that commits infanticide of murder. Then the question is, why are those things forbidden in the animal kingdom and not forbidden in our human relations? Massimo Pellucci, a biologist, writes, what we call homicide, rape, or even infanticide is very common amongst different types of animals. Lions, for example, commit infanticide on a regular basis. Now, are these kinds of acts condemned? I don't even know what that means, because the lion doesn't understand what morality is. Morality is the invention of human beings. There is no such thing as objective morality. So what I would argue here, that if atheism is true, then objective morality does not exist, and objective morality does exist, and therefore atheism is false. My fifth argument and last argument is that the evidence for consciousness and the mind point to theism, not atheism. Now, what typically follows from atheism again is physicalism, that all that exists is the material world, a spatio-temporal system, that only matter and energy exist. Non-material properties do not exist. But the problem with this is that means that the mind-body physicalism follows. That is to say that all that we can possibly view human beings is to be physical entities. But there is a great problem with that, because mental events do not share the same properties as physical events. I want to mention 3 areas. subjective experience. No one can deny that subjective experience exists. However, we cannot account for subjective experience if all that exists is the material world. Thomas Nagel, an atheist philosopher, the New York University and prominent writer of philosophy of the mind, he says in his article, What It's Like to Be a Fact, he says that an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism. Point number 2, personal identity. Personal identity, if physicalism is true, then personal identity is false. That is to say that there is no constant element to a human being that defines them to be the same person that they were when they were born, and the same person that is the same person when they die. The reason for that is this. It is well known that over 7 years, the human body regenerates itself. Say, for example, we took a chair, and the chair has 5 parts, and every year we took away a part of the chair, and we replaced it with a part. On the 6th year, would that be the same chair? No. But human beings, in the same way, they regenerate their cells and their molecules. They're not the same physical makeup as they were when they were born, and they won't be when they die. So what is that element, what is that constant that maintains the I, the personal identity? It cannot be material. Third point is the aspect of free will. If we are just physical entities, then what that means is determinism is true, that all of your actions are determined. Just like a ball rolling down a hill, it has to obey the laws of gravity. In the same way, human beings are just a product of the firing off of their DNA and their genetic makeup. All of your actions and everything that you decide to do are a part of your DNA. Francis Crick writes, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. That's all that you are. You're just a machine acting out your programming in your DNA. I think that it's safe to say that these kind of notions of free will, personal identity, and subjective experience strike at the heart of our intuitions. They must exist, but they can only exist if physicalism is false, which naturally follows from atheism. So I would argue that if atheism is true, then mental properties do not exist. Mental properties do exist that are immaterial, therefore atheism is false. Those are my 5 arguments, and for Professor Johnson to present a good case for atheism, he has to knock those down and present a positive case for atheism. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Nice to see you all here. First, I want to say a couple qualifying things. I've never really done debate before, and I think that in philosophy we don't really do debates. At least I don't. The way I teach is to, I suppose that what we're doing is inquiry. We're seeking out the grounds and the truth of a problem. And I think one thing that I learned here just now is that I don't think that you can do that. I don't think you can really inquire into a problem by getting a 20-minute barrage of vastly complex arguments. You have to slow down, stop, look at the details, examine each point very carefully in order to see whether there is grounds, whether there is good reason for making the claims that you're making. And that's what we do in philosophy, mainly. So I'm not really here to win a debate. I'm here to say we expand the horizon of inquiry about the issue whether atheism is rational. I also want to say that it's not really true that I'm an agnostic, and I'm not exactly sure if I would say I'm an atheist, but I think I'm an atheist actually, but it makes a difference. What I mean is that Mr. Deen said that an atheist, well, what I'm supposed to do is prove incontrovertibly that God doesn't exist. Well, I can tell you right now that I can't do that, and nobody can do that. But what makes me an atheist is that I do not think that any evidence we have provides sufficient reason to hold that atheism is true. And that's really all I have to say in order to be an atheist. Okay. I guess, well, let me start by saying the question is atheism rational? And I say, well, why not? Of course it's rational. I think the burden of proof is on the theist to say why atheism is not rational. Nevertheless, I need to provide reasons for why atheism is rational. And while I don't have time to provide complete arguments for these positions, I can at least state the general points that I think make atheism rational. But it should be kept in mind that a solid set of arguments will take much more time and much more dialogue. First, I think we should have some idea of what rational means. And I think Adam and I agree on this. I would like to define it as, I take rational to mean assenting to a proposition for which there is a preponderance of evidence in its favor. And on this definition, I think it's perfectly rational to be an atheist. It also seems to me that on this basis, it just may not be rational to be a theist. But I'm not really, I don't think it's a bad thing. I'm not really bothered by that. I think that actually it's rational to believe that it's possible that God exists. But I don't think it's rational to believe that God exists. Okay. Well, reasons why it's rational to be an atheist. For one, I think there's very little evidence, if any, that God exists, despite Adam's arguments. I think, well, I can't really go through all his arguments, but I will go through one. But I can say that I'm very certain that all of his points are controversial. That is, they're disputed by experts in the field, just as they are, I mean, experts in the field do not agree on whether these arguments are sound or true. So I think that should be kept in mind that these issues are not settled. Second reason, I think there is lots of evidence that God doesn't exist. And I think there are lots of problems with the arguments that are given for God's existence that make it very difficult to say that God exists. I think the problem of evil is a very, very powerful one, although not definitive, in posing a problem for the theist. The third reason, I think, is that I think that we generally ought to stick to naturalistic explanations unless there is a way, unless there is a compelling reason to move to a supernatural explanation. And the reason I think this is because I just think that, as a lot of scientists also think, that we first ought to make sure that there isn't an explanation already that could be familiar to us in naturalistic terms that we haven't overlooked. And certainly we've done this in the past, or many people have done this in the past when they've attributed, say, storms to God's wrath, or all kinds of things to supernatural agents that turned out not to be caused by supernatural agents. So I think unless we have eliminated natural explanations, we shouldn't move to supernatural. Okay. One thing I want to say also is I think we should have some idea of what we're talking about when we talk about, or when we use the word God. Because I think what often makes some of these, let's say, Adam's arguments seem successful is that most of us have an idea of what God is as some sort of, I don't know, person or an intelligence, a being that loves us, that intervenes in our lives, that we speak to and hear from, and so forth. And but I think that a lot of the arguments that are proposed for God do not portray God in this way, and they actually portray God in a way that is much closer to atheism. So, to give you an idea, I guess, and to cut things short and to focus on one particular problem, I want to just talk about one of the arguments that Mr. Deen presented or that he presented at least part of. And it's called the Kalam argument for Kalam Cosmological Argument for God. And the basic idea was this, as you might recall. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe has a cause. Okay. Well, one thing I see wrong with this is that I didn't hear the conclusion that that necessarily means that God caused the universe. So I would need to know that, at least, right? So it just doesn't follow that the cause is God. And it also doesn't follow that God is the kind of God that we think it is. So we have to know what is meant by God to make this argument work. Okay. The Kalam cosmological argument is based on two main ideas that I don't really have a problem with. One is that the Big Bang occurred, and that something cannot come from nothing. Right? So there has to be an explanation for how the universe, which began, was caused, and it had to be caused by something, because it could not be caused by nothing. And supposedly the idea is it could not have caused itself. Well, basically, all I want to say to that is, well, first let's recall what, on this account, God is said to be like. I think it's often said that God is non-spatial, non-temporal, and non-material, right? Because if God were those things, then God would be somehow part of the universe, and suppose that God has to be separate from the universe in order to create it, in order to be eternal, and all these sorts of things. Well, my problem is, and maybe Mr. Deen has an answer to this, I don't see how such a being can have any relation to the universe, and therefore be a cause of it. You see what I mean? So, if the universe and everything in it, that is time, space, and matter, began, and it must have had a cause, and God was that cause, yet God is nothing like time, space, and matter, how could God be the cause of the universe? There is no explanation. And if there is one, then it would just have to be miraculous or not understandable. In which case, the cosmological argument does not solve the problem that it set out to. That is, how it was that the universe had a cause. So I think this is a significant problem. But not only that, if the argument works at all, it really kind of points us to an idea of God that is quite atheistic in character. What is it really to say that God is when you say that God has no presence in space and time, and is nothing material, is not sensible, and so forth? Well, it's very much like saying that God isn't anything, or God isn't anything knowable. Of course, there are, say, we talk about numbers and abstract objects as being, not material and so forth. But none of those things we think of as being God. And it's also not clear that those things are thinkable entirely apart from matter. So maybe Mr. Deen can answer this question for us. I'd like to know how it is that God being characterized this way could be a cause of the universe, and why this characterization of God is not, or how this characterization of God is distinguishable from saying that God is nothing. Okay, I think that's about it. Well, I could just comment briefly on, I heard the various arguments that Mr. Deen had. Atheism is not able to demonstrate the impossibility of God. Well, I think that's true. But that's not a proof for God's existence. And he has the argument, which is familiar to many philosophers, that about God being a necessary being, but it's not at all clear that the notion of necessary being is actually a possible thing. So we would have to have an argument for that. The fine-tuning argument, I haven't really given a lot of thought to, other than to say that if the idea is that only design is the alternatives that we have there, that God must have designed the argument, God must have designed the world because it is too complex for it to come to being any other way. Well, I still have the other complaint. I don't know how it is that God, being non-spatial, non-material, and not in time, could create a world that has those characteristics. There's one other argument about objective moral evil. I think that, the claim was that you can't account for objective morals without God. And I think it's important to note that many theologians and theological philosophers reject that notion because it leads to a lot of problems. Mainly, it makes God out to be arbitrary, lacking reason, a tyrant, and there's really no explanation for the relationship between God and goodness. This problem is illustrated by what is called the use-of-pro argument, where it's the problem is to explain how what is it that makes something good? Right? Where does goodness come from? Well, on one hand, you might suppose that God makes something good. How does he do that? Well, he declares that something is good. Right? He says, this is good. Right? Well, if that's the case, then whatever God declares could be made good. And so then, if God declared that, say, kicking babies in the head was good, then that would be good because God declared it. But that can't be right? So morals just can't depend on this kind of what's called divine command ethics. Right? And it's not true that you have to just depend on physicalism for morals. There are very rich and interesting arguments based on the fact that we are rational beings, and that makes us moral agents and gives us very solid moral principles. So it just is not true that we need God for objective morality. And also it should be recognized that it's not everyone agrees that morals are objective. So we'd have to contend with that. It may not be. Issues of physicalism related to free will and so forth, there are lots of philosophical arguments that claim that even if every event is physical, that doesn't imply that we don't have free will. But I can't go into all these things because these arguments are very complicated and it would take a long time to explain and make sense. So all I can say is examine your claims carefully and slowly and see where it leads you. Okay, that's it.
In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. So, Professor John, are you atheist or agnostic right now?
I don't know why it really matters. Why does it matter?
Just, okay.
I would argue
you're agnostic about being agnostic. Okay. Right. So if you recall, I said that I was going to demonstrate this evening that atheism was disproportionate to the evidence. And quite frankly, I haven't seen any evidence this evening to support atheism. Professor John's strategy this evening was to go on the offensive and attack theism. But we're arguing, is atheism rational? And we haven't seen any arguments this evening. All we've seen is a stance of skepticism on attacking theism. But let me address some of these points that you made. First, he said that the deist shoulders the burden of proof, not the theist. I'm slightly disappointed because this is an elementary mistake in logic and philosophy, because an atheist is someone who claims, I mentioned earlier, that God does not exist, that there is positive evidence against the existence of God. So an atheist who's arguing that atheism is true must provide some positive arguments. Kai Nielsen, an atheist philosopher in the book Reason and Practice, he says, to show that an argument is invalid or unsound is not to show that the conclusion of the argument is false. All proofs of God's existence may fail, but it still may be the case that God exists. In short, to show that the proofs do not work and not enough by itself, it may still be the case that God exists. So by showing all of my arguments are faulty, it does not logically follow that God does not exist. Okay, so let's look at some of the other points. He said that he holds out that we should hold out to a naturalistic explanation and not appeal to supernatural explanation. I wholeheartedly agree. We should always hold out for the naturalistic explanation. But when we run out of options, we have to go the mile. As Socrates says, we have to follow where the evidence leads us. So if the evidence points to a supernatural cause, we have to go with the supernatural. It does not, you cannot, I think the problem with Professor Johns is that he's a methodological naturalist, that the only answer will be from the outset, from the, he presupposes the only answer is a naturalistic one. But that is false. And because it has not been demonstrated this evening, because that's begging the question. The second point is, what is God? And it's like God is nothing. Again, he has to demonstrate that something that is immaterial cannot exist. He shoulders the burden of proof. He's begging the question. He has to demonstrate this evening that the naturalistic account of reality is true, and we haven't seen that. Why can't something exist out of time and space? We haven't seen any arguments. Do we just accept this by faith? And I think that would be very helpful this evening. Now, if you remember, I presented 5 arguments. The first one was that the inability of atheism to show that God is a contradiction shows that it's an argument against atheism. And Professor John said that I haven't shown that a necessary being is even possible. Well, folks, how do we know something is impossible? If it is a logical contradiction. For example, a squared circle is not possible. But the premises that I argued, which is the controversial one, is the fact that a necessary being is possible. All that Professor Johnson has to do to show that that premise is false is to show that the existence of a God is actually a contradiction. But if it's not a contradiction, then it is possible. This is just a modal logic. It's nothing fascinating. So the point is, again, so I rest my case here that as long as it's even possible to conceive of a necessary being, it follows necessarily that God exists. Okay, so the second argument I argue that the origin of the universe points to theism, not atheism. What did Professor John say here? He said, then why does it have to be God? Why does it have to be God? Why? Because it has to be a supernatural cause. It has to be a supernatural cause because it is outside time and space. He said, well then how does that work? How does the supernatural cause bring the material cause? Well, what I will say here is this, that if atheism is true, they have a double incoherence. There is no material cause to bring the universe, it just popped into existence, uncaused, which quite frankly is worse than magic. When you have a magician and he has a hat, and he pulls a rabbit out, at least he has the hat. With this, we don't even have a hat. There's absolutely nothing, and the universe just pops into existence. So you have a double incoherence, a material problem, and also a lack of an efficient cause. With God as the explanation of the universe, we at least have an efficient cause. And he argued, and he said, well, what did he say here? He said, why does it have to be the God that religious people talk about, i.e., why does it have to be a personal God? Well, simply for this reason. For the for the universe to be an eternal cause and the effect to be a temporal, it would have to, God, this cause, had to choose freely to bring the universe into existence. Otherwise, if it was some sort of mechanical device, then the cause and the effect will exist eternally together. But since the universe is not eternal, and it began to exist, the universe must have been caused to exist by a free agent, a personal agency. So that answers that question, and maybe Professor Johnson can respond to that. The teleological argument, the fact that the evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe points to theism, not atheism. We didn't hear any arguments about that. Again, he went on the offensive and said, what is God? But I've already explained that. I also argued that the evidence for objective morality points to theism, not atheism. Here, Professor John said, well, there's a problem. Again, do you see the strategy that he goes on the offensive rather than to maintain his position? However, let me comment on that. He says, well, he says that morality becomes arbitrary, and he effectively put forward the Euthyphro dilemma. Dilemma is where basically it holds a morality to account on two fronts. Either it's arbitrary, that it's that God orders us to do the good, or God tells us to do, or what God asks us to do is good. So what we have is this dilemma. But all I have to show here that there's a third option. And then with the third option, we can split the dilemma. So effectively, this argument is a false dilemma. Why? Because the position that I'm maintaining this evening is God is the good. What Plato talked about the good is God. God is the good. He is the paradigm of good. He defines what morality is. And the laws that we have are constituted by his natural nature, his nature. They are expressed to us via the divine laws that we experience. So this argument is a false dilemma, and philosophers have pretty much abandoned this attack on theism. So those are the defenses that I'd like to put this evening for my arguments, and I will suggest here that we do look into these arguments and discover that none of them have been rebutted this evening. So I still maintain that atheism is irrational. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm not sure I can get all those points, but first of all, I didn't say, and I think the atheist doesn't need to say, that God doesn't exist. The atheist says, I don't believe that God exists. It would be ridiculous, I think, for anyone to say, to rule out categorically something that may be possible, right? It's impossible for me to prove that God doesn't exist. I have no problem admitting that. That's actually a very reasonable position to take. But that doesn't mean that God does exist either. And it also doesn't mean that I believe that God exists. Right? I don't, because there is lots of evidence, or let's say there's insufficient evidence to show that God exists. And I don't have to have a proof that God doesn't exist in order to say that. Mr. Deen is just wrong about that. He and any atheist is making what is called an ontologically positive claim. And when you do that, the burden of proof is on you to show that your claim is true. I'm not making an ontologically positive claim. I'm saying that God doesn't exist. Or I'm saying that I don't believe that God exists. All I have to show is that there's insufficient evidence for God's existence. And I think that's very, very clear. Another point, I didn't say that God does not exist outside of space and time. I didn't say that. It could be that God exists out of space and time. It may be that that's the only way that God exists. My argument was that if God exists outside of space and time, that there's no way that God could be a cause of what does exist in space and time. That was my argument. And he didn't address that point. So I think it still stands. The idea that if my criticism of the cosmological argument fails, then that means that the universe had some sort of magical cause. Well, that's not, that's not really true. But the explanation given that God is the cause of the universe is equally mysterious and magical, and really just says that a magician, God, made things appear when there's no explanation for how that could have happened. Where is the explanation for that? How? Because God, snapped his fingers or flicked a switch. It's I would need to know how that relationship between God and creation really works. That's not provided. Mr. Deen also mentioned the third option of the Euthyphro dilemma. I actually didn't speak of a dilemma, but there is a dilemma there. The dilemma is that either goodness is arbitrary if God commands what is good, or goodness is independent of God and therefore can be thought independent of God. Right? Mr. Deen's solution is to say that God and goodness are identical. Well, that's nice. That makes for a nice, pretty story. But what motivation is there for that? What if goodness is just independent of God? And so, I don't know. Maybe it isn't, maybe it is, but I don't see the argument that says that we must think that God and goodness are identical. So that's just an assertion. He also mentioned the modal argument. Again, and I just got to say, if it were that easy to prove that God exists, then I think everyone would easily assent to it. And it's just not clear that a necessary being is possible. I mean, on one hand, sure. Well, what you have to do to know whether something is possible, like Mr. Deen pointed out, you have to know whether it's logically possible, right? But you have to make sure that the phrase doesn't contain some kind of incompatibility in it. For example, I might talk about the fastest motion, right? Oh, I can sort of picture that, the fastest motion, yeah. Is it possible for there to be a fastest motion? Well, no, right? Because there could be something that's even, something moving very, very fast, there might be something moving faster than that, right? And so there isn't really an answer to the question, even though it sounds like it might be, of what the fastest motion is. Well, the same thing might be true of the idea of the necessary being, right? Is it really possible that a necessary being exists? Well, I don't know. I haven't seen the argument that shows that those two notions, necessary being, are logically compatible. I know that 17th century philosopher Leibniz tried to show that they were, and he's a really clever guy, and he couldn't do it. But there's a lot of controversy about this type of argument. The other problem with that modal argument, too, is that Adam still doesn't say anything about this. What is the necessary being? Is it God? Doesn't have to be. It could be something else. It could be an electron. I don't know. Nothing is said about this. Maybe somehow existence itself is necessary. I don't really know what that means. And I don't have the answer here. But neither does Mr. Deen. So he doesn't have arguments that say that God exists. If he did, then I would have to say, well, then I'm wrong. There is good evidence that God exists. That's just not the case. I guess I want to say one more thing about that you mentioned. Oh, well, Mr. Deen also said that I didn't have any real positive arguments for rationality of atheism. Well, I wanted to explain something about scientific method and falsifiability of claims and so forth, but it's it would take too long. But that is a positive argument for why it is that atheism is rational, because it depends on very strong, verifiable, and quote, falsifiable claims in a way that theism does not. It's very difficult to show that theism has any kind of rational scientific basis, whereas it's easy to show that atheism does. I guess the last thing I want to say is that we might talk about whether faith is rational, instead of whether atheism or theism is rational. And I'm not sure, but I think in a sense it might be. And I just want to quote the Apostle Paul. This is from Hebrews 11:1. If you're, I'll scribble that down. He says, "Faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things unseen." I think there are two things in this quote. If we can, I don't know if he's the ultimate authority on faith, but he's pretty good, so we can pay attention to what he says. On one hand, faith is based on the hope for God, not on God's existence. And I think that's an important point, very different. I can hope that God exists without believing that God does. I can hope that, well, maybe I'm wrong about the evidence, but I can still maintain that God doesn't exist. On the other hand, faith seems to be based on an unfalsifiable claim that God is not sensible, not visible, right? And in that sense, you might say that faith is not rational, if it's based on claims that are not verifiable, not falsifiable, and so forth. So, while it may be rational in some sense to hope that God exists, it does not appear to be rational to believe that God exists. And nevertheless, faith perhaps is rational, since it is inconclusive that God does not exist. Yeah, so I guess that's all.
In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. So if you recall, I put forward 5 arguments this evening to argue that the evidence points towards theism, not atheism, and atheism is disproportionate to the available evidence. My main criticism this evening for the side of atheism is first, I think it's quite obvious that Professor Johns is not an atheist, it's more of an agnostic. And the second is, and I haven't seen any kind of strong arguments for atheism. Maybe it's maybe because of that we haven't seen any strong arguments for atheism, because he's not really an atheist. If I mention now the first argument, which was the contemporary version of the ontological argument, and he said, well, Adam, you haven't shown that it's even possible for a necessary being. Well, I'm quite taken back by this question, because as I said earlier, that we can see that something is possible if it's logically possible. And the way that we determine something is logically possible if it's not a contradiction in terms. And I state again that a necessary being is possible. And given the argument that I put forward this evening, it necessarily follows that if a necessary being is even possible, then he must exist. The second argument that I put forward is that God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe, and he does not point to atheism. And he said, well, he still hasn't explained what that cause is, and how did this immaterial being cause the universe. Well, all I would say here is that I don't know, quite frankly, how God created the universe, but I do know that the universe began to exist. That the universe began to exist, and whatever begins to exist has a cause, and that cause, by definition, must be outside time and space. And the argument that I put forward, that it has to be a personal being to create a temporal universe. What's the alternative? And I say it again, don't we just believe that the universe just popped into existence? Why is it that Professor Johns takes the side of atheism over theism, if everything we have to be agnostic about, and there's no arguments either way? Why isn't he an agnostic theist? Why? Because he does believe that one side is stronger than the other, but unfortunately we haven't seen any evidence this evening. The problem with morality that I argue that the evidence for morality points to theism, not atheism, and he said something about, well, God could tell you to go kill babies or kick babies and you would have to do it. Well, the problem here is this has an illogical antecedent. It's like saying, if there was a squared circle, how many angles would it have? That question does not make sense because God is good. He is the paradigm of good. It's like saying, what's north of the North Pole? So that question itself does not make sense, and he hasn't provided a counter-argument, and he hasn't argued a positive case for atheism and objective morality. So, and also, we haven't heard much about the argument from consciousness that the evidence points towards theism, not atheism. We still haven't seen the rescuing our notions of personal identity, subjective experience, and free will. So I will finish this evening and say that I think we've seen that the arguments are decisively against atheism, and atheism we conclude is irrational for this evening anyway. Thank you very much.
I'm just hearing the same kinds of assertions over and over again, and I think I've provided lots of good evidence for my position, and I don't really know what else I can say other than the same things that I've been saying. But I guess I will say this, that all of these arguments that have been kind of thrown out here really require much more time and careful consideration to decide whether they are valid, sound, and true. So I really would want to emphasize that. I would not like someone to walk away from this debate thinking that one or other of us was right without seriously investigating these issues. Right? I think that's about it. And by the way, I am an atheist. Thank you very much.
Right now, we'll open up the floor to question and answer session. So if you'll just put your hands up and try to go around the room. And if you could just keep your questions brief and concise to the point so that we can get everyone. Thank you. So where's the microphone?
Good evening, guys. So I'm just going to comment on a few things you said in terms of content, just to highlight a few issues, not because I really want to attack the positions. I think it's important for everyone to keep note of these, just to see how these debates go and where mistakes happen and how sometimes they could cloud our judgments. Now, you committed a few fallacy of equivocation. Now, I'm a part of an online group for atheists that has about 50,000 members, and not a single one, I think, says, I'm an atheist in the sense that there is no God. So, as in philosophy always, you have strong atheism, weak atheism, strong artificial intelligence, weak artificial intelligence, strong compatibilism, weak compatibilism. We have basically strong and weak views of the same position. And you didn't really talk about the weak view as in weak atheism, negative atheism, basically the view that I don't believe in God any more than I believe in Zeus. And I think a lot of your arguments really are based on the idea of positive atheism, but as Chris tried to show, no one really adopts it because it would kind of be insane, right? It's kind of like you're trying to disprove a negative, which no one really could do. And I hope really what we get out of tonight is what, again, Chris has been emphasizing. What our friend here did was throw out a lot of arguments, and I've taken courses on these topics, and sometimes it takes 5 months, you don't really resolve them. But
goes around the earth and whatever blasphemy was done.
Excuse me.
If they were wrong about...
I'm sorry to cut you off. I appreciate your comments. But just to be fair to everyone else, we don't want to hear another lecture.
It's not the lecture. He said he wants a good debate about atheism.
I know, yes.
Give me one more line. Okay, if they
last line, go ahead.
Yes, last line. If they were wrong about the science and whatever scientific facts they had back then, if they were wrong about it all that time, so why can't they be wrong about God? And why does God have to be the default?
Okay, yeah, that's the thank you. Yeah, so please, if we can tolerate a comment or two, but not another lecture. So if you have, so next question, please. Anyone else to say anything?
I didn't hear a question. So.
Yeah, all right.
Can I just respond to a point?
gentleman made a point about we don't need God because we have evolution in order to be moral. Yes, but I think you misunderstood my position this evening. I'm not saying that you have to believe in God to behave morally. I'm arguing that without God, morality doesn't make sense. It's just a mere illusion. And many atheists and theists concur that if God does not exist, then our notions of morality are just subjective expressions of personal taste. That if it helps, the question I'm asking is an ontological question, the existence of morality in the world. Just as this bottle exists here, I'm arguing and posing the question, where is morality? Where is good and evil? Where is it under the table? Where is it? Is it in our pockets? Where is good and evil? I can't see it anywhere. What you're referring to is epistemology, how we come to know morality. And from the Islamic perspective, or the theistic perspective, is that we believe that God has instilled in us a sense of morality. But sometimes it becomes jaded, and then we can refer to revelation or consensus and so forth. But the question is more ontological. Where is this? If you say that morality is grounded in evolution, that won't do, because then morality becomes a product of socio-biological evolution, and it doesn't have to be that way. Darwin was very aware of this. He said that if we more or less rewind the history of evolution, it could well be that morality turns out something completely different, where we end up killing each other, that our mothers kill their children. He spoke about bees, for example, and slavery. So that won't do. The question is, can there exist an objective morality without God? And I think there's a tremendous task to show that.
I just want to say, if you would like to investigate the grounds of morality, take my course next semester. You do that all semester, 3 months.
We have a crash course right now.
No, there's no such thing as a crash course.
Okay. So, where's the mic now? Okay. Right here.
Yeah, hi. I have 2 questions, if you don't mind, for Dr. Jones. Number one, why is it that the higher up you go in the social ladder in any society, the less religious people are? The lower down you go in the social ladder, the more religious they are, number one. Number two, give me a sec here.
You always come back.
They will come back to me some other time. Sorry.
I don't know for sure, but I guess this. I take what you mean by higher in the social ladder. Higher level of education, or do you just mean
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so you don't mean just the richer you are.
I'm not talking about money.
Yeah.
I'm talking about education, I'm talking about awareness, I'm talking about, you know.
I think as far as I know statistically, there is a correlation between levels of education and belief in, say, religious precepts or something, right, or religion. And at the lower levels, they tend to believe more so. And I don't know, these things are really complex, but I would offer this, that people who, say, lack education tend to lack also money and means and do not live well, and therefore find a lot more comfort in the idea of loving God than do those who have more education and have probably a bit more money, but who also have had opportunity to consider the reasons for believing and have found a lot of them quite lacking, perhaps. That's the best I can do. It doesn't mean really much of anything. It's just a sociological kind of fact or of interest.
Yeah. This kind of like, I think what you're alluding to here is this idea that somehow the religious people are intellectual nincompoops. But can I just say that view is just grounded in ignorance. If you look at the kind of revived renaissance that's happening in the hard sciences and the soft sciences, especially in the States, more and more of these professors and academics are actually becoming theists. And recent studies show that it's almost 50-50. There are humanists, agnostics, and atheists compared to theists are virtually 50-50. So this idea that somehow religious people are ignorant, uneducated, and for that reason believe in God is just purely ignorant. What I would say, however, that if we look at, let's say, atheists, I think it's not to do with the evidence. I think there's psychological reasons why people are atheists. I think, for example, if you look at the very, let's say, well-known atheists like Dawkins, Hitchens, I guarantee at a lunch that they've had some kind of problem in their lives with a father figure of some sort, or they had this kind of anger towards God. Darwin, for example, had great problems with the death of his daughter, and in his work he talks about he was angry for God. Freud also had a similar problem as well. So I think that atheism is more to do with psychology rather than philosophy. That's my position.
I just want to say that I'm not a theist and nobody hit me as a child. And my question would be on you were basing on 4 main arguments.
5.
5, but there was no clear jump. The jump wasn't clear between the transition, right, to the theistic God. It wasn't clear at all, like how you jumped. You were playing on words a lot. There were no clear arguments.
Oh, that's a great accusation. Playing on words. I think I did. I think I put some. I mean, these questions were raised during the debate. Why is it God? And it's quite obvious why it's God, because it had the cause of the universe has to be a cause that is outside time and space. And if you recall, I did say that it had to be a personal God. For if the universe, for it to be a temporal existence, it had the eternal cause. If it was a mechanical device of some sort, an eternal mechanical device that caused the universe, then the eternal cause could not exist without the effect being eternal. But for it to be a temporal, the eternal cause must have chosen to bring the universe into existence. The second point also that I mentioned is that if we apprehend objective morality, there is good and evil, this being that we're talking about, this transcendent being, must be a moral being. Otherwise, we have to reject our notions of morality. This is why J.L. Mackie, he had this problem. He said, well, okay, how is this that good and evil exist? Then either God exists or objective morality does not exist. He went for the objective morality not existing, because there is this tension. So the being that we have is not only a necessary being, he is a personal being. He is an intelligent being. Why? Because the initial conditions of the universe had to be calibrated, which presuppose an intelligence. So he had to be an intelligent being and also a moral being, just because we apprehend morality. So I would beg to differ. I think I did put an argument for what God is. Thank you.
It so happens that in my teaching career, I was teaching physics and ethics to the graduating classes. When it is philosophizing physics, I would say galaxies of galaxies with no end, light traveling since eternity, some stars having the light of some stars hasn't yet reached us, possibilities, kinds of insects, millions, kinds of animals, unlimited. The study of the history of the development of man also suggests something else. Now, when my turn comes the other way around, where is the situation of God exists in this category? On the other hand, when it is my time to defend, I will tell them, Well, if someone lives stealing, hitting, dealing bad with people, cheating people, and somebody else lives the straight way, the good life, who will judge? Would they end the same? Is it logical? It is not logical. Therefore, who will consider the future, eternal life, later life of such people? God. Energy manages the first question, or God solves the problem in the other question.
Okay, go ahead.
Before the universe exists, what was God doing?
Before the universe existed, what was God
I was waiting for you to ask to put you on hand.
He was contemplating what to do with people who ask silly questions.
Yes, could we move to the side of the room now? Yes. No, go ahead.
I just want to comment on something that Dr. Rogers did not really give any evidence, and he was just proving you wrong, and he didn't even succeed. But even when you are proving you wrong, and even if you prove someone wrong, it doesn't make you right. So he didn't give us any pure evidence, and not even one for the last 35 minutes. He was just in circles and proving you wrong. And just one thing, he said that he's an atheist. And you said at the beginning of the lecture that you both agree that atheism, when you maintain something, that God does not exist. So, it's something we should doubt him. He's not an atheist also. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can properly address the comment, but again, it's possible to say that being rational means assenting to a proposition on the basis of a preponderance of belief or preponderance of evidence. Right? So based on that, that's why I'm an atheist. Right? There's no what's the I don't know the problem. Yeah, I did not prove. Okay. No, that's what I'm saying. That's not what atheism is about. So we seem to have a disagreement about that. He says that, and but we don't. Let me address the other. I didn't prove that God doesn't exist. That's true. I don't have any problem saying that. I'm fine to admit that. All that I'm doing is saying the question is atheism rational? And that's the question that I'm answering. And I haven't seen why it's irrational. Give me an argument for that.
Yes. We need to go back to how we defined rational, and it's the agreed definition, which is a belief that is proportionate to the evidence. Now, is atheism proportionate to the evidence? What does the evidence show us? That we have to, if we're an atheist, we have to accept that the universe just popped into existence, all by magic, without a cause. It begins to exist, but it doesn't have a cause. The second thing, that we have to just accept the brute fact that the initial conditions of the universe were delicately, exquisitely fine-tuned, and we live on a razor's edge, literally on a razor's edge of existence. It all happened by itself. Then we have to believe that this thing that we apprehend of objective morality just is a brute fact, but it's completely inconsistent with the naturalistic story of creation. Then we have to accept that the consciousness is a brute fact. We have to deny personal identity. We have to deny subjective experience, which we know subjective experience exists, and we have to deny free will. That is atheism. And who is going to accept that? And I put to you this evening that that is irrational. If that's not irrational, I don't know what is. Thank you very much.
I'll try to be brief because I have responses to the three of the arguments that you have given on theism. Very good. First, you said you gave an argument that the universe must have had a cause. Okay, that seems to be a plausible argument at first sight. But if we look back into history, for example, at the ancient Greeks, they couldn't explain what caused certain natural phenomena, so they attributed it to supernatural causes. Why? Because they didn't have the ways and the means in order to explain this. Also, Dr. Jones mentioned something very important, which is we have to go back to the definition of causality. Causality, when something causes something else, that means that the cause must have preceded the effect. That means causality depends on time. The Big Bang is the explosion of the singularity of space-time. Space and time have been formed with the Big Bang. So if there is no such thing as before the Big Bang, that means the causality here is negated. When you say in another argument of yours, you said that God is not a logical contradiction. Here it depends on the definition you have given of God. Is it only the omnipotent God, only the omniscient, only the creator? Because if it's only one of those or some of those, it's not the biblical or the Quranic God. If it's all of them, it seems to apply some logical contradiction, like in the omnipotence versus omniscience argument or the argument from evil.
Okay, now we're getting to the nitty-gritty. This is a very good response, very good question, I have to say. So firstly, let's go to the first point that you made, what was the first point that you made? Right, okay, yeah. Okay, that's a good point. That we can't, again, that we exhaust all attempts for naturalistic explanations and that we should hold out for supernatural. I totally agree. But what you're missing here is that the beginning of the universe is confirmed by empirical science. That you can't deny that. It's like denying the gravity that the universe began to exist. That there is just overwhelming evidence. Let's just say, for example, we have to be humble and we have to hold out. But remember, we're asking the question, is it the most reasonable position to maintain? Even if we follow your line of reasoning and say, look, we have to be humble, we have to hold out to a possibility that we can explain this. Granted. But this moment in time, what is it reasonable to say that the universe began to exist? And anyone who holds the view that the universe began to exist, Stephen Hawking said, for example, in Space and Time, he said that everyone now believes that the universe began to exist. So anyone who holds the idea that the universe began to exist is confidently and strongly within mainstream science. Now, if you want to hold a fringe view, a radical view, go ahead, but it's not mainstream science. Now, good point about the causality. So remember, the first premise is what? Whatever begins to exist has a cause, right? And you're saying that's only makes sense within space and time. What you misunderstand, the point that I think you're confusing here is this is a metaphysical principle, not a physical. The idea that being does not come from non-being. So we can still make that inference. And also, what is the relative difference between something coming into existence during time and at the beginning of time? There is no relevant difference. If something can't come uncaused during time, it can't come uncaused at the beginning of time. So the reason that we make the inference is because of that first principle of metaphysics, that being only comes from non-being.
But attributing
now,
the beginning of the universe to a God, that's an inference, not a fact.
What do you mean, sorry, it's not a fact?
There is a difference between a fact and an inference. An inference is what we believe something to be.
Well, I'm not saying I'm not saying, look, what I'm presenting this evening, I'm not saying that I have proof as a mathematical equation. I'm saying, what is the more reasonable position to maintain? And my argument this evening is that atheism is not a reasonable position to maintain, given the fact that it goes against overwhelming evidence. Now, the last point that you made was about the God contradicting. I don't think that is the case. And you said about the evil, right? Okay, so all-powerful... Yeah, okay. Well, I don't see a contradiction there. It's all, you know, if we're going to present arguments, we're discussing more than statements. But what I would say here is that there hasn't been a philosopher that has presented a definite contradiction between those attributes of God. I haven't seen any. Okay. But the point here is that, for example, okay, let me comment on one of them, on evil. That how is an all-powerful God that is good and loving allows for the evil to exist in the world? So the proposition is what? All-powerful God and loving, good God. Proposition 2, evil and suffering exist in the world. Now, philosophers have realized that there is no logical contradiction between these propositions. No, there's no logical contradiction. It does not necessarily follow. In order for this to follow necessarily, you have to outline the implicit contradiction. The implicit contradiction is what? The implicit contradiction is that God, that would want the world to be in a certain way, right? I.e., a world without any evil or suffering. But what you misunderstand there is that we can't have a world where we have free will and evil doesn't exist. Because that would mean that you're asking God to freely make you do something. You're asking God to freely make you choose good. But that's a contradiction. So on the surface, this contradiction that you're presenting, on the surface looks like an argument against the existence of God, but in actual fact, when we look at it deeply, it actually affirms, not only is not a good argument, but also affirms theism. Why? Because paradoxically, you have apprehended evil and suffering. You're saying that's an objective argument. You're saying that's objectively apprehending evil and suffering. But I argued earlier this evening that we can't have objective morality, objective evil without God. So your argument is actually an argument for theism, not atheism.
But the evil that I meant was not only the evil that I mentioned was not only the evil of the resulting from the human actions, but also natural.
Natural disaster. I have an answer for that as well. We can talk about that afterwards, if you like.
Would you like to say something?
I just wanted to say that thanks for pointing out the issue of causality. You put it in a better way than I did. I think it's a serious problem. Yeah, I mean, I think basically just saying that, well, nothing, you know, something cannot come from nothing, therefore God must have made it happen. That's just, the explanation is just equally mysterious. It doesn't solve anything.
If we could move the line all the way to the guy at the very last row, he's had his hand up forever.
I'm just sorry, I just want to point out some things because I have a lot of problems with the arguments that you gave. You gave 4 or 5 arguments, 4 of which I noticed. So I just want to run my points of view on these and maybe you can tell me what you think. First of all, you talked a lot about to show how difficult it is for the world to exist the way it has existed now, that if it were at the point of expansion, the speed was only this much smaller, then the world wouldn't have come to exist and things like that. To simplify the argument, it would mean that the probability of the world to exist in this way is so little, so it must have had a creator, and I don't think that that's logical because obviously, for example, like the obvious counter-argument is that the probability of me having been born at that specific date, at that point of the world, is so little, but then again, you can't tell me that that's not what happened. So if the probability of the world to have been shaped the way it is so no, it does not necessarily mean that God must have existed, or that it did come to be at random. The second point you made was something about the world being infinite, that if it were infinite in time before, then there must have been an infinite number of causes that must have happened, and then therefore this point in time could not have come to exist because it would still be moving on in the infinite number of points in time. And the counter-argument that I would like to present to that is if you were to move your finger 1 centimeter in space, then you could logically think of an infinite number of points between that 1 centimeter. Maybe 0.0001 centimeter, 0.00001. So you can draw out an infinite number of points over there. But then again, if you move your finger, eventually it's going to get there. So in the same way, I think it's logical, since your finger would move across an infinite number of points in space, then in just the same way, you could imagine that time would have passed through an infinite number of points in time, and then the present time could have come to exist.
Okay, 30 seconds.
Yeah, can I just...
if we could just revise on your comments.
So you argue that high probability does not mean necessarily that it's an intelligence behind it. It could be an accident. The position that I'm maintaining this evening is not just high probability, but also specified pattern. So it's not just high probability; it's specified pattern. And let me just give you an example. So, for example, if we had a billion balls, and we only had, for example, a humongous bucket, and I asked Rami here to pull out a ball. Any ball is probable; it has equal probability. But what if I said that there's only 5 white balls in there, and you only have 5 goes in a bucket of a billion balls? You only have 5 goes, and if you get 5 goes, then you're set, and then I will let you go. Otherwise, I'll shoot you.
Yeah, but
now, if you let me finish that. And then he has 5 goes, and the first ball is white, the second one, and so forth. And each go is white. Now, what tips us off here is a specified pattern. What tips us off here is that it must have been rigged. That tips us off. Now, my point is here is that if we're being tipped off that it's rigged, and that there was nothing before the universe, then it gives us good reasons to believe that there is an intelligence behind the universe in order to fine-tune it. Look, it's like this. Anthony Flew put it like this. Imagine you randomly chose a country to go on holiday, right? Randomly chose a country. And then you randomly chose a city. Then you randomly chose a town. Then you randomly chose a hotel. You randomly chose a room. And you walked into that room, and the room was to your taste. The carpet, the curtains, all the DVDs were your favorite DVDs, your films, all the channels were pre-tuned, all the programs that you like. They even have the food that you like, that you love to eat, even your mother's cooking in that room, right? Would you not say that there's a conspiracy here? Yes, you would. But guess what? The universe is a far bigger conspiracy. Why is it that we do not carry the same canons of reason like we do in that situation and not the other? That's what I would say. That's my answer.
There are other people that have questions.
Just one comment about that. The universe had about 14 billion years to become suitable to our taste.
Yes.
No, I just want to say that I came to this debate to know that if atheism is rational. I didn't get the answer for that. But I got a good definition for atheism, which you were saying that, I'm not saying that there is no God, Mr. Jones. I'm just saying that it can be a electron. It can be something supernatural. Now, I just Googled up atheism and said it's commonly described as a position that there is no God. It can also mean the rejection of belief in the existence of a God. A broader meaning is simply the absence of belief that any God exists. If you want more, I can read. So you were saying the difference of that. So I don't know. I came here for if atheism is rational, and then he gave me a new definition for atheism. Can you reply to that or something? Because you got lost here.
I'm not sure if I have a good response to that. Other than, I don't rely on Google for my definitions.
What about the encyclopedia?
Or necessarily encyclopedias. And I think it's perfectly coherent to say that, look, as Kalam or Kareem made the point that the difference is between an epistemological position and a belief. So, from a standpoint of epistemology, what it is that is possible to know and how we know. Right? I think that it's possible that God exists. Right? But as a matter of the available evidence, to me, it says that God does not exist. Right? And I think that's a very reasonable position because I don't rule out the possibility of things that I really can't speak about.
That's not, you're contradicting yourself.
No, I'm not.
You are, because you're saying that there's a probability that there is a God, but I'm choosing to not think that there is a God. So if there's a God, I would
because of available evidence, I think that there is not a God.
Okay, so
there's no
probability.
There's no contradiction.
You're the first atheist that says there's probability.
No, I'm not the first one to say that, right? Lots of people say that. The other thing is, it's not so clear that that's important what my position is. What is important is the position that I'm defending, and that is saying that atheism is rational. That's all. What?
Without giving evidence.
I gave lots of reasons to believe that atheism is rational. If you don't accept them, then there's nothing I can do about it. But, okay, then,
Okay, we're just going to call it a day. I want to thank everyone for showing up. You're all welcome to stick behind and personally have confidence and ask questions to both speakers if you want to have more discussions. And I just want to advertise for tomorrow's event. I'm sure you've seen the flyer all over campus, the poster. What is the evidence for Islam? Same lecture hall tomorrow at the same time, 5. Hopefully it's 5.